Welcome to Steve Wraith's True Crime Podcast, and today I'm joined by top crime author Wensley Clarkson. Welcome, Wensley. How are you?
Good evening, Steve. I'm very well, thanks.
Great to have you on. A big admirer of your work, and obviously we've managed to meet up, and you've helped us out with various projects, namely, in recent times, the Fred documentary, which was a big success about Freddie Foreman. So obviously during lockdown, been doing a lot of interviews with former criminals. So I just thought it was time to give the authors a bit of a push, and I'm glad to have you on. So what I'd say first of all is, how did you become a crime author, Wensley? It's not something that you wake up one morning and say, I'm going to do. And how did you become a crime author?
It's a good question. I mean, I was a reporter on a newspaper 33 years ago. In fact, more than that. I started 40 years ago. I became a crime reporter briefly. But really, if I'm honest about it, the reason I became a true crime writer is I started off in LA in the late 80s, early 90s, writing about celebrities. And I did a couple of celebrity books and they were a nightmare to do. And then I was asked to do a book about a criminal with a criminal. And he was so much nicer to deal with than any of the celebrities. I thought, I'm sticking to criminals from now on.
So what was the first book that you did?
The first one I did was called Hell Hath No Fury, which is about women who killed. And probably the first one subject book was on Kenny Noye, who may or may not be well known to your viewers. It's a debatable point because he's well known to us, but I'm not so sure he's well known to anyone under the age of 50. But obviously he was a very famous criminal in his day. Yeah.
So the process of writing a book, I know what you have to go through, but I've taken up the same kind of mantle as you and done a few up in the northeast and Scotland, etc. Busy writing Paul Massey's book at the minute in Manchester. So from your perspective, how did you go about writing that first book?
I was lucky with that because it was separate cases per chapter. There was a case per chapter, so I sort of approached it like I was writing 12 feature articles for a newspaper. But when I'm doing a one subject book and listening to you doing ghostwriting, which I have done and I found very, very hard, I've got to be honest with you, it's extremely hard work for half the money, I always say. And the other thing about writing books, in case there's anyone out there who thinks they're going to make $1 million straight away, if I worked out what I earned per hour, I'd be paid a lot less than even the minimum wage. So I'm not trying to get the violins out, but it's hard work is what I'm saying. It really is. The only reason I've survived is because I've written a lot of books. I took a decision that I would write a lot of books because I was pretty sure I wasn't so brilliant that I'd sell millions of every copy.
Yeah, it isn't a quick fix, and you certainly don't become a millionaire unless you're J.K. Rowling, that's for certain. Do you hit a writer's block? Have you ever hit that situation? And if you do, how do you deal with that? I mean, I know personally speaking, I've become, quite astute, and I know when I'm not going to be able to do something and I'll walk away. I had one of those days today. Actually, I've been working non-stop on books since lockdown started. I finished the new Sayers book and I moved straight onto the Massey book, and I found that my time today was better served doing other things for myself, and I've had a day away from it, and I know I'll go back tomorrow and I'll be refreshed. Does that happen with you, Wensley?
It happens a lot, and what's happened with me during lockdown is just before the lockdown happened, I was approached by a big publisher and asked if I wanted to do a 5-book deal, which is a lot of books. I wouldn't normally have agreed to do so many in one go, so to speak, or in one contract, but I knew that the lockdown was coming, so I took the entire contract and signed up, and now I'm on book number 3 of 5. Well, in fact, it's 6 because there's another one for another publisher. And I relate to what you're saying. I'm at the moment in the middle of this process, and it's quite hard to jump from one book to the next. And it's not so much the solitary stuff. I quite like that. As for writer's block, I'm a journalist, so by nature, I always have something in front of me, and when I even write fiction, which I have done in the past, I always try and have some point of reference. And I would say to anyone writing a book, don't look at a blank page because you won't get anywhere. yes, write something down, but at the same time, go onto Google and cut and paste something just to that might be vaguely related to what you want to write about, and just have something to start with, an anchor, I call it.
Yeah, that's good advice. I mean, and it's something which I'd started doing, I think, about 2 years ago. And as you said, even if you feel as if you've made that little bit of progress during the day, I've tried to do something today. Whether it's a bit of research, whether it's ringing somebody up and speaking to them about the subject matter, whether it's whether it's typing something up. It's all relevant, and you feel as if you're making some progress. And it's surprising how much progress you do make when you think you're not making any progress. I know I've caught up with a few people this week and spoken to them on the phone, not recorded them, just had a conversation with them, and then suddenly I've had a eureka moment about something, and I think reading as well. Are you a great reader? Because I mean, obviously,
I am. I don't have enough time to read because at the moment I'm reading so many books. But yes, I am. And one of the most shocking things about some of the people I've ghostwritten for, and I'm not just talking about criminals, but in the past, and I don't ghostwrite as much as you, but I have done, is most of them haven't read many books, so they don't really understand the process. And what's quite shocking is because they don't read a lot of books, they don't understand what is acceptable in terms of what you're going to get published. And that can make the relationship on ghostwriting quite tricky, to be honest.
Yeah. Let's go back to the Kenny Noye book, because it's a book which I think it was the first book that I read of yours. Difficult subject matter, was it? Or, was it something that you were concerned about writing because of Kenny's reputation?
To put it into context, he was on the run when I wrote the first version of the book. So we're talking about over 20 years ago. I tried to stick to the facts. Obviously, the book is fact-based, but it's very hard because when you're writing about a criminal and only the police will provide you with most of the material, there's going to be a slant in it. And it's quite difficult explaining that to criminals particularly. I've tried to be as accurate as possible. I realize it's an uphill task. If I write books for people in the general public to read. I don't write books for the criminal I've written about to read, because if I did, I'd only sell about 20 copies. So it's very important to know that. It doesn't help the criminal that I'm saying this, but it is important. I have to write a book that's entertaining and that people will want to keep turning the pages off. And that means I have to sometimes miss stuff out, sometimes move forward very much faster than what actually happened in real life. And that can be difficult for people to appreciate.
Yeah. I mean, have you had communication with Kenny Noye about the book? Is it true that he... No.
No, I've had a few problems, but I think in fairness to him, he served his time, he's out. I've actually refused to really talk on main broadcasters about him anymore, because I think he needs, like everyone else who served their time, a chance to prove himself. And I've deliberately stepped back from talking about him. I don't know him, and I've never pretended to know him personally. I know people who obviously know him. And he is a fascinating character, there's no doubt about that. But I think he is one of the last of a dying breed in reality. Because I wrote a book last year called The Crossing, which was about the Eastern European invasion of certainly Southeast England and other parts of England. And we're really in a different crime world. It's a different underworld now in Britain. And I think people have to wake up to that fact. You know, the time when people like we know, like Freddie Foreman and so on, would be very nice to old ladies and help them across the road, those days have long gone. The characters that were there before are not there anymore. It's big business and it's very ruthless, much more so than it used to be.
How important have, your connections been over the years to put the books together? Because, obviously you mentioned Freddie. I know, you're very good friends, close to Freddie, as I am. Have those kind of contacts been important when you've been wanting information and putting things together?
Sometimes they've been helpful. Fred we've always been more about friendship than about helping me, which I totally understand. And I think overall, all my books tend to be more slanted towards the criminal. I don't have contacts with the police. having talked about the Noye book, that was 25 years ago and there was no other information around. But on the whole, if you look at most Noye books, they're all about the criminal. They're not, I'm not fed information by the police non-stop. I don't have big sources inside the police, but I do have a lot of sources in the underworld. And they help me a lot. And some of my books these days cross over. I did a book about the Brinks-Mat Robbery, which obviously Kenneth Noye had a peripheral part to play in. And that's crossed over to the Hatton Garden Robbery and so on. It's amazing how many of these crimes do cross over into each other.
Yeah, The Curse of the Brinks-Mat, if anybody hasn't read that, is a fantastic book. It's it explains in layman's terms, the simplicity of the whole thing, but then how complex it becomes. And I think really what comes across, and I've interviewed a few armed robbers over the last couple of days. I think it was Vinnie Bradish who came out with the saying that money is the root of all evil. And if there's a story that highlights that, it's the Brinks-Mat.
Absolutely. It's a phenomenal one. And for anyone who doesn't know, in a nutshell, we had the biggest gold robbery in history in 1983. But since then, now more than 30 people have been murdered in the name of that robbery, the aftermath of it. And we're talking about policemen, private eyes, criminals, you name it. And it's still going on to this day. The revenge was fueled by people stealing some of the gold from the robbers, and it goes on and on. It is a fascinating book. Obviously, I would say that I wrote it, but it's really something that encapsulates the history of the underworld over the last 40 years. And for anyone who's interested in that, I'd recommend the book for that reason alone.
No, it's a fantastic read. It's definitely up there with one of my my favourite crime books, Wensley. I really do enjoy it. Charlie Wilson, of course, one of the great train robbers. Another fascinating character. And anyone who's watching this who hasn't, heard of the Great Train Robbery, those of you maybe living abroad, it was a famous robbery in the 1960s. They robbed the mail train. Fascinating story. Some great characters came from that, the likes of Ronnie Biggs and, of course, the late great Bruce Reynolds as well, Tommy Wisby. But Charlie Wilson was involved in that, and he's become a bit of a fascinating character for yourself. You've written about him, and of course your new book, which is coming out, one of the 5 or 6, should I say, that you've been asked to write during lockdown. You're focusing again on Charlie Wilson.
Yes, I am. I did a book on Charlie Wilson about 15 years ago when the word narco wasn't even in our dictionary, I remember being fascinated by the fact he got killed by a hitman in 1990, but I remember being fascinated by the fact that he'd switched from being an armed robber, gone to prison, escaped, and his life story is phenomenal. But then the last 10 or 15 years, he was a major narcotics dealer. There's no point in denying it, based in southern Spain. And that's what made him interesting. Well, of course, Narcos, the series on Netflix, and other shows and other stories and other characters from Mexico, El Chapo and so on, have made this an even more fascinating subject that a lot of people want to read about. So I developed the second half of my original book about Charlie Wilson and interviewed far more people about his involvement in the narcotics underworld. And the result is Secret Narco, because anyone who remembers Charlie Wilson when in his heyday, when he was a great train robber, and by the way, he contributed a lot to the Great Train Robbery. He was one of the 2 main men involved in planning it. Anyway, it will be fascinating to people that he then went through that process, went through prison, escaped prison. I mean, as I said, his life story is phenomenal before he even gets to meeting Pablo Escobar. And the rest is just absolutely fascinating and tragic, and a tragic ending to it.
Yeah, I mean, it was a horrific end, but I think anybody who, saw, what happened to Charlie, and, it was well publicized. It was professional execution. It was quite obvious that, Charlie was in deep in the drugs world, and I'm looking forward to that. That should be a really good.
That's out tomorrow.
That's out tomorrow. Of course, you can get all of these books on Amazon. We'll give it a good shout out at the end of the show. What was the original Charlie Wilson book that you did? Just remind us.
It's called Killing Charlie, and it was really primarily about his life as a bank robber right up to when he got killed by an assassin in his garden. But as I said earlier, the drugs element to it was not as significant then. And I realized I was sitting on that and needed to develop that further. And that's where Secret Narco comes from.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that, you know, obviously crime has changed, and of course over the years that you've covered it as both a journalist and as a writer, crime has changed massively. We've gone from, you know, pavement robberies and jump ups to, you know, being the main source of income for your local criminal to, you know, drug gangs running things now. And The Real Top Boys is another book that you've been writing, focusing on the true story of London's deadliest street gangs. And I suppose that's going to take you to, you know, bring you up to date and tell you where we're at with crime on the streets of London now.
It certainly does. And it was a fascinating book to do because it's the complete opposite end to the Charlie Wilsons and Kenny Noyes. But it's just as important, and now probably more important. And it told me, my research told me a lot about what these kids are going through and why they end up being street gangsters. How a lot of housing estates in London, and not just London, but around Britain in major cities, have become almost self-contained places where gangs rule with a rod of iron, where the police don't like to go into. And I think it would shock quite a lot of people to know this, because, you know, we're supposedly a first world country, but crime is thriving in these environments, and it's cruel. And the other irony is that we know all about the massive number of knife attacks which have occurred, and the amount of kids, especially in London, being murdered with knives. A lot of that comes from the pressure those children are on, the peer pressure, which has forced them to carry knives. And a lot of that pressure comes from Eastern European drug barons who are supplying the drugs that these street dealers are selling. And these kids are so terrified of them, they carry knives because they're afraid of losing territory to other street gangs. So we're in a cycle of violence, and there's absolutely no sign of it ending.
Yeah, it's quite terrifying. I think a lot of people who, you know, read these books, you know, I think they don't grasp what's actually going on outside their front door at night when they've got the curtains closed.
Well, they don't, but I'll tell you, in Real Top Boys, you really do go into these council estates. You do, you really meet the people who are involved, and you understand them. And it's not just a wham bam wallop book. I'm dealing with all the issues, even down to the fact that mothers protect their sons. You know, everything's in there, and it is really interesting. And I hope it will attract a new type of readership, obviously younger people. And I think it's really important, especially with all the Black Lives Matter stuff that's going on now, which is so crucial. It's, part of that is in there because people have been dismissed and discarded, and stop and search rules had been so overweighted in favor of the police that they created so much resentment. I mean, there are huge issues there. I won't bore you about now, but for anyone who's interested in it as a subject, there's a lot more there than just a few stories of gangsters.
Yeah, I mean, you have specialised in gangsters, but you've also delved into so many other issues. I mean, we couldn't go through every single book, so I've picked out a couple of other ones that you've done. Evil Beyond Belief is a one about, of course, Dr. Death, Harold Shipman. You know, a little bit different, you know, that, and, you know, serial killer, potentially Britain's biggest serial killer.
Yeah, Dr. Shipman's fascinating, and yet it's only, I don't know, 15 years since he committed most of his crimes, maybe a bit longer than that. And yet I think there are a lot of people out there who've forgotten all about him. Just to remind you, you know, he was a doctor who used his role as a GP to lure mainly elderly people into his web of death, because that's what it was. And he became addicted to killing them. And himself, he was addicted to heroin, even though you wouldn't think it looking at him as a character. He looked like a friendly, sort of overweight, middle-aged doctor. So he was an exception because we luckily don't have Dr. Shipmans on every street corner. However, I believe that there are other Dr. Shipmans around and we don't hear much about them. And imagine for yourselves now, how many people have died in the way that he killed people, and we didn't even realize they were murdered.
Yeah, it's a crazy story, and anyone gets the opportunity to look at that particular case, it does interest me. Fascinating case, and again another good book to read. One that I found like in the archives. I'm not sure whether you'll thank us for bringing this one up, but as a Geordie, I'm going to, and that is Thing: The Secret Life of Gordon Sumner. What
That was my
on earth possessed you to write that?
Money mainly, and the fact I had 4 kids, and pay for them to go to school and so on. Actually, to be fair, that was I researched that book very carefully. I went to Brazil, I went to lots of places, and it was interesting. And I look at him now, and he is fascinating because, number one, he looks fantastic, and he's in his late 60s, and he still looks very good. But more importantly, he admits he was tough, and he was a really tough bloke when he was in that group, and he split that group up, the police. But there is something quite appealing about him as well, and the book did very well, and I discovered a lot about him that showed what a down-to-earth sort of bloke he is, actually, despite the fact that people talk about him as this egomaniacal, yoga-obsessed rock star. But there's a lot more to him than that. He's a canny guy. He's a canny Geordie, basically.
You picked up the accent there as well, Wensley, which is what I like to hear. Another couple of books that I do want to talk about. First and foremost, Bindon, a character which I always found fascinating. I really enjoyed that book, and I think it came out more or less the same time as I think it was Channel 4 did a documentary on John Bindon, and he was an actor, but he was involved with a lot of the gangsters, and of course he was living the life on screen, but he was living the life off screen as well.
Well, Bindon is a fascinating character, a larger than life guy who ended up appearing in films as an actor. He ended up breaking lots of laws as a criminal, and he ended up getting off a murder charge. Oh, I'm sorry, I nearly forgot. And he also supposedly slept with Princess Margaret. So he did quite a lot of stuff. Now, just by coincidence, Steve, only yesterday I signed a deal with a film company to develop that into a TV series. I can see exactly where they're coming from, because John Bindon was all about West London, the King's Road, which is near to where I come from, in the 1960s, 70s, and mid-80s. And it was rocking, that area. And there was John Bindon, this larger-than-life character in every sense, including various below-the-belt senses. He was... there never will be another one. It's very difficult to explain, to encapsulate everything about him. But he will make a fascinating lead character in this series, I hope, because it was another era. And I think it's quite important to never forget these eras and what life was like there. And really and honestly, I'm going to sound like a real old fart here, people did seem to have a lot more fun at that, in the 70s and 80s and maybe 90s. Coronavirus apart, obviously that's not fun, but it feels like that. And I think colourful characters like John Bindon, who came out of nowhere. He was in a film called Performance with Mick Jagger, which I'd recommend to anyone to watch. It's completely surreal, but it's a wonderful film. He played a criminal in that. He taught the actors how to be a criminal. And then guess what? He was accused, and he did kill a man in a nightclub shortly after that, but he got off on the basis that it was self-defense. Some believe that his relationship with Princess Margaret helped him get off that charge. I'm just touching the surface here. There's so much about Bindon.
Yeah, it's an amazing, amazing story. I'm delighted, and congratulations on that. That will be fantastic. I look forward to seeing that develop. I'm sure it'll be a fantastic TV series. Another couple of books I'd like to touch on before I come to the last book that you will be working on throughout this lockdown period is Killing Goldfinger, which of course is about John Palmer. Tell us a little bit about that one.
Well, I wrote this 5 years ago. We were talking about Charlie Wilson earlier, who was murdered by a hitman in his garden. John Palmer, who took part in we didn't take part in the Brinks-Mat, but he filtered some of the gold and turned it into money. He was killed in the garden of his house shortly after the Hatton Garden Robbery 5 years ago. And I wrote a book called Killing Goldfinger because he represented 40 to 50 years of criminality, starting in Birmingham, going to the West Country, then he's involved with Brinks-Mat. But the biggest thing of all was he then went to Tenerife, which a lot of people will know all about, and he set up timeshare businesses in Tenerife that made him hundreds of millions of pounds. He put pressure on people to buy a lot of these timeshares, and in the end, he was run off Tenerife. But that wasn't before he'd made literally hundreds of millions of pounds. And he was running that island at one stage. And my book revolves really around his life on that island. And it is it's another one I've just sold the rights to. But it's a really interesting story. The way he died, and his murder's never been solved either. And I hasten to add, I've written 3 major books about people killed by hitmen, and none of them have those murders been solved, which says a lot. In the case of Palmer, it happened in Essex. In the case of Charlie Wilson, it was Spain. So I suppose it was a long way from here. But there's another one I did called Moody, which was about a criminal also murdered by a hitman in the middle of London. That wasn't solved. So I'm afraid the message there is if you want to kill someone and get away with it, get a hitman to do it for you.
Yeah. We spoke about this briefly at the start of the interview, Sexy Beasts, the Hatton Garden Mob. Have you ever had to write a more bizarre book and a bizarre story? Because I think when we all saw this, there's always that British mentality of when you hear what they've got away with, you almost have a little cheer for the villains and you hope they're going to get away. That mentality's still there from the Great Train Robbery days. And, you know, once the gang were finally nabbed, we find out that it's a team of old age pensioners who are trying to pull off one last heist, one last job. And there's some well-known faces involved in it as well.
They always say in the robbery trade that it's the aftermath that matters, not the actual job. They pulled off a brilliant job. They got their goods, their money, and all their stuff out of these safety deposit boxes. But they sadly were old codgers, and they didn't think about CCTV cameras. They didn't think about leaving a paper trail through their computers and their phones and so on. And that's what brought them to justice. I feel sorry for them because I don't believe they got away with as much as people think they did. I've always understood, and people need to read my book to see the full story of why, that there was another motive behind the robbery, and that they were financed, these robbers, by one particular family who needed to get hold of some material that was in those safety deposit boxes. But at the same time, there is a tragic element to it because they were so old, and there was a crossover between a couple of members of that gang and the Brinks-Mat Robbery and so on. And it was beyond belief. And I have to say, one of the worst films I've ever seen was made about that robbery. It was awful, with Michael Caine and a few others. And I'm glad to say I did not sell the rights of my book to them. I sold them to another mob who made a much better film. But ultimately, that is a one-off that I don't think will ever happen again. I cannot see a group of elderly criminals trying to do what those guys did. And it's only 5 years ago they did it.
Yeah, an amazing scenario that. And again, another great book. You mentioned The Crossing earlier. Before COVID, all we were talking about was Brexit, and it's had its effects on crime as well.
It's had an extraordinary effect on crime. Basically, Britain is the richest country in Europe as far as criminals are concerned. So about 10 years ago, a lot of foreign criminals started to appear in Britain, maybe even longer. But in recent years, Brexit or no Brexit, they're here to stay. And what my book, The Crossing, shows is that they've actually set themselves up as, they've got their own little netherworld, really. A lot of the Eastern European gangs, they're incredibly efficient. They're incredibly ruthless, but they're far more reliable than the old school British equivalents. They treat crime as a full-time business. And if you talk to anyone who deals with the Eastern European criminals, there's a fear of them, but there's also an admiration because they run their businesses so well. And my book really outlines the way they've invaded, the extraordinary fact that they have taken over. They've run all the old British criminals out of town, really. And they're here to stay. Brexit, as I say, Brexit or no Brexit.
The book that you wrote, Gangsters, is one of the few books that you can get on the market which looks a little bit at one of the most notorious families in London. And I'm not talking about the Crays, I'm talking about the Adams family. And there's very little said about that family, but that's a great insight into the workings of them and what's gone on over the years.
What I will say, in fairness, is it's only one chapter on the Adamses in that book. I would love to do a book about them, an entire book. And in a way, I would say to any of their friends, if they're watching, get them to get in touch, because I'll give them a fair crack of the whip, because there is a place for a book with the entire Adams family. Going back to the one you mentioned, that's just one case that's in there. The Adamses may not be well known in the Northeast, I'm sure, but they cross over to so many different crimes. They had a role in Hatton Garden, Brinks-Mat, you name it. And as far as I'm aware, they're still out there. And I have talked to people who've worked for them recently, and they're still very active.
Yeah, it's a hell of a story, and one that needs to be told. So hopefully they will reach out. I'm not sure whether this is one of your favourite TV programmes, Line of Duty, but you've been given the job of writing a book, which is probably one a lot of criminals will want to buy. It's the true story of British police corruption, of which we both know there is a lot of, having covered a lot of crime books over the years. So tell us about that and what, you know, I presume it says it is what it says on the tin, but you know, what particular cases are you looking at in particular?
I'm looking at quite a number of cases, but I actually had a personal relevancy to this, because I was hired by the Macpherson Report after the death of Stephen Lawrence in London in the 90s to try and investigate the police corruption, as well as the colour prejudice that was going on within the police force at that time. I came up with an enormous amount of material that proved that there were corrupt policemen involved in that investigation, and that they helped their friends who were related to some of the suspects to get off. Cut a long story short, I've outlined a huge amount about that in there, and I've even been re-interviewed by the police in the last year about what happened in terms of police corruption during the Stephen Lawrence investigation. But the book itself highlights other cases, and it is stunning, the amount of corruption that is out there in our police force, or our police forces across the nation. And what I've tried to do is to encapsulate it, but also run some parallel material about the TV show, because actually the TV show is pretty good. It's a lot better than the average TV cop dramas in this country. And it does show a side of policing that we don't often see. And it doesn't pretend it's not there. And that's a good thing. And I think actually it's probably helped step up the amount of prosecutions for police corruption that have been occurring in this country in the last few years, because it's made people more aware of it.
Are there any books that you wish you'd done that, you know, is there a book that got away from Wensley Clarkson? I mean, you mentioned you'd love to do one on the Adams family, but is there any other books where you think, oh, I'd love to have done that?
Yeah, the Adams family were one. I would have liked to have done a book about Pablo Escobar. There's too many around there. What a person to have interviewed if he was alive. But I think I've done pretty well all the books I've wanted to do. Every single book I write, I come up with. It's my idea, and I pitch it to a publisher, and then I get a deal. So I can really say hand on heart, I've pretty well done most of the books I want to do. But I've got a number coming up, and I've got one that's coming out later this year, which I think will stun people, where I've actually been nurturing a hitman, a real hitman, and a very unusual hitman at that. And he's given me his entire life story. And that book will be out at the end of the year. And it's called I Am a Hitman, written by him, but with my help. And I'm really predicting that one will go places, because it's not just about wham bam shooting people dead. There's a lot more in that story than you would imagine. And it's fascinating. And it's even relevant to marriage as well, and relationships, because we get to hear how this guy manages to keep his marriage together. And I've got great hopes for that.
That sounds fascinating. I look forward to that. The Cray twins are obviously something which it's an amazing industry now. It's, you know, I've written numerous books about them. I continue to contribute to TV documentaries. You've done numerous, you know, appearances on shows over the years. Does it surprise you that, you know, Ron has obviously been dead 1995. Reg and Charlie both died in 2000. 20 years on, another book has come out about the Boothby affair. I've got a copy of it. I haven't read it yet, but that's another book. I think we're up to something like 70 books on the craze. Does it amaze you? Does it amaze you that that's how that's turned out?
No, it doesn't, because they were so unique and they had a name. If they were called the Smiths, we might not remember them so well. I mean, I think that everything about them being twins, the world that they inhabited, 60s London, all these elements are there, and people just are getting more and more nostalgic for this. It's amazing to think people get nostalgic about killers, but they do, and about that world. And I'm not surprised, Stephen. I'm not surprised you're still doing them. And I think there's still more books to come. I'm not quite sure what, but I'm sure there will be. The Boothby thing being re-examined is probably influenced a lot by television, because I noticed that television started going back to these historic type events, like Jeremy Thorpe was another one, and turning them into dramas, and very good dramas. I can see the Boothby story ending up being a drama. So I should think that's a lot to do with why a book has come out on that. As far as the Craze are concerned themselves, as I've just said, they were unique. There's nothing like them. Okay, the Richardsons were probably more powerful, but they were not a pair of twins. And I think that's where I don't know any other criminal team that was headed up by a pair of twins. And until someone comes along like that, I imagine the Craze will rule supreme, even from beyond the grave.
You mentioned earlier, you know, the landscape's changed, and that's what you've covered, you know, superbly in The Crossing, and I'm sure you will in the books that come out later this year. You know, are there any British criminals who are still top of the game? The Adams, you say you feel as if they're still operational, but London is obviously the capital of, you know, the UK. Is it a cosmopolitan of criminals? Who's the strongest force down there nowadays?
Well, it's not the British, I can tell you that. It's the Russians, it's the Albanians, and I'm not sure who else. It seems to be primarily from those two countries, and they're all there. And the Russian mafia, mainly from St. Petersburg, which is Putin's hometown, they are ruling so much, and they also have their fingers in everything. You know, we're talking about involvement with oligarchs all the way down to involvement with the street dealers in the real top boys. You know, they're covering a lot of area, and they're even more ruthless than the Albanians. And at the moment, I haven't seen any sign of any up and coming British criminals who could even get close to these sort of characters. Maybe someone will come through, but I doubt it. I think it's such a dangerous area now that most of the old school professional criminals have stepped back and taken the attitude that it's not worth losing their life over.
I've got to ask you, I mean, you've been locked down like everybody else. COVID has hit everybody. What's your take on all of this? There's, and the news in particular, do you believe what you see on the news, Wensley? Because, you know, we're led to believe that this is a virus and that it's come from a bat and it's come from China, but I've got to be honest, I don't listen to the news a great deal. I don't believe what I see. What's your take on the whole thing?
I'm not so sure I believe what I see. I believe the scientists, but their priorities are different. So they're not politicians and they're not businessmen. So they can only tell you what they feel in pure scientific terms. I think that obviously coronavirus exists, obviously. However, where it's come from is very worrying. Where we're going at the moment is very worrying, because if what we're being led to believe is correct, there's going to be another outbreak, and it's going to be worse than what we've been through. It's a very difficult time, and I consider myself lucky. I've got a few books to do. I'm locked down. I'm quite happy being locked down. It's normal for me. But for most people out there, particularly people under 30 or 40, it's really hard. Not only are their jobs under threat if they have a job, but they also don't have a life. And if they go out and try and have a life, they face criticism or they face being moved on by the police. It's really tricky. And I'm not quite sure where it's all going to end up. And I'm sorry to be very doom-laden about it. But the one thing I will say about masks, because I know masks have become this weirdly political thing, I take the attitude that I'd wear a mask because what's the big deal? I don't see it as a big deal to wear the mask. And if it does make a difference, then one should wear it. I don't agree with all this, oh, I'm not wearing a mask, it's not macho enough and all that crap. I really do think just wear a mask, who cares? Why are we so worried about what we look like in a mask? I don't get that one. But on a more serious level, I haven't got a clue, and why would I have a clue? I'm a bit doom-laden about it, and I feel sorry for the next generation down. I really do, and the ones and my grandchildren. I really worry for them.
Yeah, me too. It's certainly uncharted waters, and you know, very concerning. But you know, you've like myself, you know, we're very creative. You've managed to sit yourself down and crack on and write books. I've done the same, and you know, as long as we've got our health and my family's got our health, that's the most important thing. Just want to you know, finish off really just by promoting where people can, you know, find out about you. You know, you're on Twitter, which is great. You know, how important is that for you for promotion in particular? You interact a lot with people at Wensley Clarkson on Twitter. What I find fascinating is you basically share links with a lot of stuff that's going on. So, you know, how important is that for you to sell books, to have that social media presence?
Very good question. I don't do it anywhere near as much as you or a lot of other people because I don't really have the time. But more importantly, I'm not entirely comfortable doing too much stuff directly. I don't know how much difference it makes. What I do know is I have a website called wensleyclarkson.com and I get thousands of hits on that all every single week, I mean virtually every day, and that will tell anyone who's watching this everything about me in an accurate way. I apologize ahead to anyone who tweets me on an open message. I tend not to answer them. Come on to me on a private message, yes. And the reason is quite simple. I want people to see what I'm being inspired by. I don't think I'm the important part of this. So I just want to, I put stories out there from newspapers, magazines that I see that interest me, and I pass them on. I'll tell you one little anecdote. More than 25 years, I think just about the time that, in fact, it was before the internet, I tore a small one-paragraph story about a body that was found in the garden of a person's house in the West Country. I tore it out, and that was all they had in the paper. And that turned out to be Fred West. So I've got a good eye, is what I'm saying. So when I put that stuff up on Twitter, just think about why I'm doing it. Because I deliberately pick the stuff I think has potential.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's great, and you know, I follow you and you know, regularly share that stuff. Usually on my Facebook page, we have a Facebook page, and people love it. And it's you know, there's always going to be a thirst for crime, and I do feel, Wensley, I'm not sure if you would agree. I think it's just because, you know, people like the escapism. People like to read about, you know, these things which they've never gotten any intention of doing, but they just have. You know, they have to have the escapism, and they do it by reading books, you know, about criminals getting away with various crimes and misdemeanors.
Yeah, it's funny that people still want to be terrified.
But it's a good thing. It's a good thing. Okay, so wensleyclarkson.com and at Wensley Clarkson on Twitter are the places where you can find out about Wensley, and you can check out all of the books on there, including the one about Sting, which I think I might purchase, I think. But yeah, listen, best of luck with all the books. I'm delighted that you've managed to secure these TV shows as well. I'm sure that they'll be, you know, obviously it takes a long time for them to be developed, written and developed and brought out, but that's something to look forward to. And have you got any message for people watching, Wensley?
Stay strong. No, I hate that phrase. And no, I mean, crime's here to stay. It ain't going anywhere. And, you know, I will continue to write about it as long as I can. And, you know, I think it's good that people know about crime, right? And that they're not all hiding behind their front doors, because one has to face up to the reality of why it exists.
Yeah, great stuff. Great message. Wensley Clarkson, thanks very much for joining us.
Take care. Thank you. Bye.